Rachel? Fantastic, thank you. This evening, my guest is Susanna Rustin, talking about her book, Sexed, A History of British Feminism. Susanna is a journalist at The Guardian and previously worked at the Financial Times. She's currently a leader writer on social affairs and has worked as an editor on the opinion and review sections. She grew up in London and still lives there with her family. She's also a local campaigner and helped set up her local community council. Susanna was one of 6 women who spoke at the brilliant Women's Places in the Media event in 2023. Now, please put your Zoom screen on speaker view for the best view of the discussion, and please mute yourselves to hear a fascinating talk. Welcome, Susanna.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm really pleased to be here talking to you.
Great. Your book is a fascinating read. This is my copy, and it's a really good read. I can recommend it to everybody. Each chapter is organised around a theme. So it's rebels, organisers, crusaders, suffragists, suffragettes. There's a difference. Legislators, housewives, liberators, specialists, and feminists. So there's 9 different themes. It's full of famous names, and you introduce us to others we dearly want to know more about. Did you enjoy writing it?
Yeah, writing a book is hard work. I've not written a book before, so I was very daunted. The lengths I'm used to, a minute fraction of the length of a book. Writing articles and editorials that are usually quite brief. But I did enjoy both the research and the writing very much, and I really hope that my sort of enjoyment of the stories comes across in the reading. I mean, I think some of the individuals and some of the campaigns, it's also a chronological account, so I've tried to find a theme for each chapter, but it's also a broad sweep of history, starting in the 1790s and going and right up to the present. So I was obviously just really hoping to convey that interest so that readers could share in it.
Yeah, well, I certainly got that, and I think our other viewers here tonight would get the same frisson, really. And as well, you've got lots of links at the end, and if you get the Kindle version, for instance, you can actually click on the links from the Kindle version. So it's so easy to go to other links. And I found out about Florence Nightingale writing a piece called Cassandra, which I hadn't heard about. I've downloaded that for later, and that's really interesting. You first look at Mary Wollstonecraft, famous Mary Wollstonecraft, then less well-known overnight follower, Anna Wheeler, translator of the French paper, "Only by emancipating women will we emancipate the worker." Can you mute, please? Do you think that Wheeler was better able to move Mary's work on than she would have been had she lived because of scandalous Mary Wollstonecraft's scandalous private life?
So I think that, as is pretty well known, Mary Wollstonecraft's, own personal history, her suicide attempts and being an unmarried mother, meant that her reputation was scandalous, really, for much of the 19th century, except among very sort of radical alternative groups where she was still, hugely admired. But I think that the other reason why her sort of legacy was not sort of pursued more energetically than it was political, was nothing to do with her personally, was obviously to do with the fact that after the French Revolution, there's this colossal reaction against radicalism and revolutionaries, and she was a liberal revolutionary. So I think that it's hard to balance up really the sort of extent to which sort of personal moral judgments of her, as opposed to a kind of broader context of, political reaction, meant that her flame, while never extinguished, was certainly sort of struggled to burn. But one of the things that, I found thrilling about, writing the book really was I didn't know anything about Anna Wheeler, whose book, which has this incredibly long title, doesn't it? I don't think I'll have to look it up. But was quite deliberately a sort of sequel or follow-up. It paid very explicit sort of tribute to Mary Wollstonecraft, you know, in its opening. So it was to sort of trace this kind of lineage of sort of radical feminist writings, which obviously I knew about Mary Wollstonecraft, and most of us do, but there are loads more really important staging posts, and it's just really interesting, I think, to sort of follow that through. And Millicent Fawcett, the suffragist campaigner, wrote the introduction to a centenary edition to A Vindication of the Rights of Women, which is, you know, a fascinating document in itself, her way of dealing with Mary Wollstonecraft's sort of not respectable credentials and her radicalism, because, you know, Fawcett is not as radical as Wollstonecraft in her desires for sort of total societal overthrow and regeneration. But nevertheless, Millicent Fawcett absolutely recognises Wollstonecraft as a kind of, you know, crucial sort of foremother and hero, really. She's so extraordinary.
Yeah, yeah. And all those links are actually in endnotes at the back of the book. So, you know, it's a really great resource just for the endnotes, to be honest, quite apart from the fun of reading the book. Throughout, you give us references like this to other further reading. One of them is a recommendation in chapter 1 for Bonnie Anderson's Joyous Greetings, the first international women's movement, which you say is a wonderful book for illuminating connections between women's movements in different countries, which sounds like editorial rather than just a straightforward endnote. Or your link to the In Our Time conversation on A Room of One's Own. Is it too easy for us to focus only on feminism in Britain and ignore the needs and purposes of Black and ethnic minority women?
So I'm glad you've asked me that question. That, you know, that book about the sort of links between feminists in Europe and the United States, I think it is mostly limited to that in that book, Joyous Greetings. I found that book sort of wonderful and fascinating. I mean, obviously the danger in writing a book about feminism in one country is that you are, you know, sort of a bit myopic or blinkered, and that, you know, by focusing on one country, you sort of neglect sort of internationalism and comparisons and so on, and that sort of wider framework. But I guess my decision in writing this book was, you know, that not every book can do everything. And I thought that a book that was specifically about the way that feminism had developed in the UK, and obviously even the UK itself is a complicated place. I had to think quite carefully about, you know, whether it was British or, you know, it's often English feminism that I'm writing about, although, you know, it is also Scottish, Welsh and Irish and Northern Irish feminism. But obviously you can't write about Britain in the 19th century without acknowledging its empire. There's a lot of really interesting historical scholarship about the relationship between the women's movement and imperial politics. And then obviously in the 20th century, you know, particularly in the post-war period when, you know, after the post-war immigration, then, you know, Black and minority ethnic women become a much more significant presence in the UK. And then, you know, that's one of the issues that the women's liberation movement and, you know, wider sort of social reform and progressive movements from the 60s onwards are kind of dealing with is, you know, sort of social change, but campaigns and demands from women's groups, but also Black politics, you know, in addition to trade union politics and, you know, and then gay and lesbian liberation movements and so on. So, so I really hope that the book kind of is inclusive in that sense, you know, and kind of acknowledges that, you know, feminism is a big story.
Yeah, it really is a big story. And thanks to you, I've got a mural box habit now. I hadn't realised that this screenwriter and director was the biggest force in British or in feminist directing that we've had so far, I believe. So
yeah, my colleague Rachel Cook pointed me to Muriel Box in her book about the 1950s women.
Excellent. Now, in talking about the organisers, you refer to Elizabeth Blackwell, who was the first British woman doctor. Like the Owenite midwife, Emma Martin, Blackwell was troubled by the control exerted by men over women's reproductive health care. You say, every department at St Bart's was cordially open to me, she says, Dr. Blackwell says, except the Department for Female Diseases, she noted. Why do you think this is?
Well, it's a really striking quote, that, isn't it? Which is, no doubt why it's been sort of pulled out by, biographers and noted by other, by scholars. I mean, I guess I think that the sort of sinister motive, if you like, that is about control. Is that, obviously, reproduction is one of the areas over which there's a real battle fought. Both reproductive life, but also the right, rights as parents over children, right through the 19th century is a real battleground, because at the start of the 19th century, married women don't really have any rights over their children. If they're separated or divorced, the fathers get to make all the decisions, which led to a sort of paradoxical situation where unmarried women, who obviously in other respects were very lacking in rights and very poorly treated, had more rights over their own children, because there was no husband to sort of trump them. So I suppose I think the sort of darker explanation is that you have, the male medical profession is a kind of extension of a kind of a sort of patriarchy, basically, that seeks to control and deny women agency in this whole area of life, and that the idea of women taking responsibility and being in charge of deciding if and when to have babies, and how many to have, and other aspects of reproductive health, is kind of threatening to men, really. I mean, I think a more benign explanation is that as doctors then definitely wouldn't have been married women, because virtually no married women worked. And, there might have been a kind of sort of faux chivalrous fear that women were too sort of delicate flowers, couldn't sort of cope with the difficulties that women's bodies, encountered, which obviously lots of, and it's the true of healthcare in general, obviously, that people had to cope with dreadful things that we nowadays take for granted are curable or, treatable. But obviously, reproductive health and childbirth and so on was very, very dangerous, and also obviously left women with all sorts of complications, which hardly bear thinking about, really, when you think about the limited options that they had available to them. So possibly there was that a bit more, but anyway, I guess I would veer towards the less charitable interpretation.
Yes, it's tempting, isn't it, to look at what was going on in Budapest, when that doctor was looking at the rich women who were able to afford genuine doctors, and they had a much higher rate of puerperal fever than the poor women who could only afford midwives.
Oh, I didn't know that. Yeah.
This chap, whose name escapes me now, but it drove him mad eventually, and because the doctors wouldn't accept that wearing their gowns that were, festooned and encrusted with their years of experience of accoucheur, were actually doing harm to the women that they were treating. I'll think of it later, maybe much too late. But I mean, midwives were Ignaz Semmelweis. Thank you, Catherine. Yeah, and that shows that in some ways, care by women midwives was better for women than care by doctors. But that's another story. Now, Florence Nightingale is a great 19th century life that we all seem to be familiar with many more interesting aspects than the myth that we are familiar with. A statistician, the analyst of the first census. I'm curious about something you saying Nightingale did not support women's access to medical training. What was behind that, would you say?
So I think that Florence Nightingale belongs to a kind of interesting category of historical personages who might call sexist feminists, which might sound like well, first of all, one maybe shouldn't call her a feminist. Actually, in the book, I don't really use the term until women started to use it about themselves, which is in the 1920s, really. So it's a bit of an anachronism. But I suppose what I mean is that she was, in one sense, an advocate for women having opportunities and being able to do things, absolutely including her, but not limited to her, that they hadn't previously been able to do. And the book or sort of pamphlet that you mentioned earlier, Cassandra, which wasn't published until the 1920s, and even then only privately, is the most extraordinary read. I mean, it's one of the kind of most enraged accounts of the sort of enforced passivity and domesticity of Victorian young women. You know, it really does bristle with just her absolute fury at the way that women were expected to behave. But she, despite that, which is just really interesting, I think, she absolutely didn't believe that women were the same as men. She had this quite strict sort of segregated workforce sort of ideas. You know, she thought that the nursing, you know, and its kind of sanitary mission, you know, should be women's work. And she didn't think that, you know, she was quite happy to leave the doctoring to men. So she's just, you know, she's far from unique in having some of those attitudes. You know, quite a lot of women who were very energetic advocates for women also thought that, you know, women had special qualities. In fact, this goes back to Mary Wollstonecraft, you know, that the kind of their role in the home, their responsibility for children, their different sexual conduct, which obviously in the 19th century women were incredibly aware of. You know, prostitution is endemic. You know, plenty of violence against women. So women, you know, sometimes take refuge in the idea that they're sort of morally superior, you know, and have a kind of special role in life, which is often overlaid with either kind of pseudoscientific or religious or sort of philosophical kind of justifications for that kind of idea. And so I would say that, you know, Florence Nightingale is sort of absolutely one of those, you know, fits in that sort of broad category of women who are advocates. And she's an, you know, extraordinary person herself, her life story. And she became really very, very important figure politically, sort of advising the government and so on, you know, military medicine. But nevertheless, you know, you can't really easily call her a feminist in any modern sense.
No, no. But she did make a difference, which
absolutely, oh yeah,
yeah.
massively, yeah.
There are plenty of occasions when I had to think again about familiar women. You write Hester Burton, who was Barbara Bodyshun's first biographer. Barbara Bodyshun, the reformer and one of the founders of Girton College, I think, argued that George Eliot's fiction surpassed anything that her more practically minded friends achieved. She says Eliot's contribution to the emancipation of women lay in her own career and in the creation of characters like Dinah Morris, Maggie Tulliver, and blessed Dorothea Curzorban, heroines utterly unlike the vapid young ladies of the average Victorian novel. Now, do you think that in growing up with Dorothea, Maggie, Dinah, and the others, we've internalized the characteristics of strong women?
So I mean, I'm not a political philosopher by training, or, you know, I studied literature and history. So I suppose, you know, part of the reason I put that quote in the book and I kind of warmed to it is because it means a lot to me, the idea that literature is you know, is important and socially important. And obviously my book, you know, it's not got that much kind of literary culture in it. It's mostly quite a practical book about women who were quite focused on, you know, politics with a capital P and sort of practical campaigning and actually trying to change laws and you know, change the way society was. But I love that. I've been in the relationship between George Eliot, Marion Evans, and Barbara Bowdeshaw, who you just mentioned, who are very dear friends, is kind of one of my favorite relationships in the book. In fact, you know, Barbara's was such a nice woman, I think, that a lot of her relationship with her friend Bessie Parks as well, and the way that she kind of coordinated a whole group of activists sort of around herself and was quite self-effacing, I think, and you know, a kind of not an egotist at all, and so was very effective, as you know, that's why that chapter is called Organisers, because these were a group who were very effective at getting things done. And Barbara was sort of the linchpin of that, but George Eliot was her special friend, and it's actually really moving how inspired Barbara and her other friends are by George Eliot's professional achievements once she starts publishing her novels. It's as if there's just this, I mean, they're writing and publishing themselves, although obviously they haven't been formally educated, but they've got sort of mostly liberal parents, so they've had some education privately. Barbara was, you know, jealous of her brother going to university and obviously didn't have that opportunity, but campaigned for for girls to have it in the future. But when so George Eliot is like this massive morale boost. You know, they sort of just think, wow, you know, women can do this. This is bloody amazing. And I sort of loved that bit. And I thought that quote from Hester Burton's book was just really interesting and thought-provoking, really. It's just that, you know, it's impossible. You can't sort of say whether practical campaigning or novels, you know, which you know, it's comparing apples and pears. But I suppose just for me personally, and my mum, you know, as people who sort of grew up reading all those Victorian novels, that, you know, the Brontes kind of loomed quite large for me. And there's a quote in the book as well from Simone de Beauvoir about the influence on her of reading about Maggie Tulliver when she was a teenager. So that's not just limited to sort of, you know, England. So yes, I absolutely do think that fiction influences people and changes the world as well. And I think that the kind of moral complexity of the female characters in George Eliot's books are a really a good example.
Yeah. Well, I do too. I agree with you. Now, next question, Josephine Butler, who's a star really of the 19th century, isn't she? And fellow campaigners for the repeal of the Contagious Diseases Act, which, if you haven't read about this, you know, people really should. They used heightened language and shocking visual aids when they were doing their public speaking. Now, they achieved a lot eventually. It took a long time for them to accomplish this. But do you think their speeches, they would be interesting, but do you think they'd be used to appeal to audience as a horror show as much as anything else?
So I guess the you know, the campaign for the repeal of the Contagious Diseases Act, which, just in case anyone doesn't know, was basically a set of laws that enabled sort of police and sort of specialist military police to forcibly inspect the genitals of women that they suspected of being prostitutes in a sort of as a kind of part of a public health campaign to stop the spread of venereal disease, but didn't apply to inspection of men, particularly soldiers. This was a particular problem in kind of military and garrison towns. So there was a campaign that only went on for about 10 years of sort of intense campaign. And one of the things about the campaign, which is marvelous, as you said, is that it succeeds. It's a win. And it's just a very, very dramatic story. And Josephine Butler is a marvel. And I've been thinking about her quite a bit, actually, in the last few days in relation to the return of child sexual exploitation to the news last week, and you know, sort of the government's you know, sort of revisiting of the independent inquiry on sexual abuse, and the sort of realization that nothing has really been done despite this 7-year inquiry, and, you know, etc. So I mean, it absolutely is, you know, when you get into sexual morality, you get into this massively sort of, you know, heightened language. And obviously the Victorians were, you know, had very intense feelings and opinions about sexual conduct and morality, and they also were operating in a situation where, you know, the situation was really grim. And I was just reading another book the other day, in fact, by Stefan Zweig, this kind of Austrian, his memoir, Austrian Jewish novelist and author, and he was also recalling, he just said that modern people, I guess he was writing in the 40s. He said people nowadays just don't understand how endemic sort of street prostitution was, you know. So I absolutely think they use shock tactics. Yes, I mean they used to hold up the speculums that were used in these inspections and say this is an instrument of torture, which is obviously quite funny to women who go for cervical smears now and are quite familiar with the speculum. But yes, it was absolutely was part of that campaign's tactic to shock people. But I think they were right to argue for a repeal, and Josephine Butler was right to be outraged by the kind of inequality that was absolutely intrinsic to that, you know, to that way of, you know, supposedly managing public health.
Yeah. Who's actually carrying out these inspections? Were they women nurses, or were they?
So she calls it, no, I think mostly men. She calls it a kind of devilish triumvirate. It's sort of police, courts and sort of medical. It's, you know, it's a kind of, she really does recognize, she's one of the first, I think, to sort of identify, you know, the state, I suppose, as this kind of patriarchal state and its different branches. And obviously in relation to prostitutes, she sort of sees it as a really oppressive sort of state apparatus, kind of tripartite, you know, and is absolutely determined to sort of overthrow it, or, you know, reduce its power.
Yeah. Fortunately for us, for society, they did actually win that campaign. But there were a lot of the campaigns that, like the struggle to get the suffrage, was long and almost never ending, it seemed. I think lots of women, you know, died in sort of sorrow that they hadn't managed to achieve that in their lifetime. But you actually named somebody who was the first woman to vote. She'd been mis-enrolled as a voter. So we actually know who the first person was, first woman to be able to vote, although it was probably, I don't know, was it discounted or removed from the...
So they were taken, she went to court. I mean, I think there's a few, because women were allowed to vote in some women were allowed to vote in some local elections. I think it's not quite as clear cut as that.
Right.
But that case that was taken by Richard Pankhurst, Emmeline's husband, you know, was taken as a kind of test case to sort of try and argue it out in court, you know, much as some of the kind of, you know, lawfare cases nowadays do, that they decided to kind of try and make a sort of, you know, make a point about the fact that this lady had, you know, who was a widow with a business, which was, those were the women that were seen as having the most valid entitlement to vote, because they, were in.
But even so, even getting to the point of women being able to vote in local elections, that took such a lot of doing, didn't it?
Yeah, the whole thing is, I mean, it's an absolutely colossal struggle.
And of course, you know, that didn't come about until 1928 fully. So you say that Jenny Lee, when she stood, she was actually too young to be able to vote for herself if she'd been voting at home. So,
yes, no, that's right. It's a sort of peculiar anomaly, yes, that she's elected before she's old enough to vote.
Yeah. So in talking about the suffragists, you make the point that some, like Millicent Fawcett, kept their distance from repealers like Butler, but lots were active in both movements, and suffragism was understood as part of a broader programme for women's advancement. Can you tell us a bit more about the differing targets, the different campaigns?
Yeah. So, I mean, so I guess there is a series of Victorian campaigns. I've mentioned education in relation to Barbara Bowdishaw and her pals. That's both schools and, you know, women's colleges, you know, become a really important sort of case. And then also employment, you know, what women are allowed to do. And then you get the Contagious Diseases Act. And then, but from the sort of mid-19th century onwards, you know, suffrage is and the Married Women's Property Act as well, trying to increase the rights of married women over children, but also over property, so they're just more independent and less dependent. But from the mid-19th century onwards, you know, suffrage is always there, sort of bubbling along. And I think it's a really interesting and important moment when that a kind of crucial hinge, actually, in the sort of history of the women's movement, when that movement sort of starts to reach its end, and then there's a kind of a sort of you know, kind of question about what comes next, you know, what comes after suffragism. And that's why I think where the word feminism really comes from, is because up until then they're all suffragists. They've got the kind of term already, that they've for sort of 70 years plus been trying to get the vote. And then once suffragism is sort of over, and it's sort of, okay, what are, you know, who are we and what are we? And I write quite a bit about the, you know, a particular sort of big row and sort of schism that formed in the 1920s, which I think is really relevant today, because broadly speaking, I think it's between sort of equality feminists who really want to focus on, you know, removing the persistent sort of impediments to women's equal participation with men in sort of political and civil life. So, well, first of all, being able to stand for Parliament, as well as being allowed to elect people for Parliament, being able to be in the House of Lords, which isn't allowed until 1958, and sort of being able to be educated like men, being able to work in the legal profession like men. You know, the church, obviously, that has still not been fully won that battle. So that's the kind of equality feminism. And then the other sort of wing is, you know, what can be described as difference feminism, which, you know, those women absolutely do think that women should be able to do all those things like become lawyers and so forth, but they also are interested in a whole set of sort of social issues, which are kind of, you know, women's issues, which includes birth control, reproductive health. I mean, lots of stuff basically connected with bodies. So it's more concerned with the differences of the differences between women and men, and not necessarily trying to, you know, argue that women should be treated the same as men in every way, because women also have some specific needs, for example, you know, maternity benefits and some issues around, you know, safety and sexual violence, you know, those kinds of issues, which have obviously, you know, obviously still absolutely important and topical. So I think that's a really interesting sort of moment when there's that kind of thing. Okay, we got the vote. We all, I mean, the suffrage movement is absolutely schismatic in itself. Huge rows about tactics and strategy in relation to suffrage, but at least in the suffrage movement they've got the same goal.
Yes.
You know, although it's hard enough to kind of cohere around that. But once you've got the suffrage movement out of the way, then they haven't even got the same goal. They've got to then work out what the priorities are. And there are various efforts to sort of codify that. The 6-point group is one. And then the kind of reconstitution of the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, which is the main suffragist organisation led by Millicent Fawcett. And it's, you know, what happens at its annual meetings. You know, I haven't spent months in the archives kind of, you know, reading all the papers of those meetings, but I'm sure they're absolutely fascinating because they had some really big decisions to make.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about looking at minutes of committees I've been on, like Women's Institute, and some of them are really fascinating. And
Yeah.
it's the same old, you know, I'm sure there would be gems to be found if you...
Yeah, I'm sure there are.
Yeah. Now, you tell us a lot about Harriet Taylor Mill and her husband, Liberal MP John Stuart Mill, who are icons of free speech and should be examples to the Liberal Democrat Party, certainly on free speech and women's rights. How can our feminist history help our party now, you know, as Liberal Democrats? Not only women as a whole, but us.
Yeah. So I was really pleased with the title that we chose for this event today, because you know, I think that, you know, history is hugely absorbing and kind of rewarding in its own right, and I do think that knowing more about the history of women's activism can be useful, and to any you know, woman who's interested in women's rights today. I just think it helps you to be more grounded. It just makes you feel more confident. It makes you better able to sort of understand what the kind of debates now, because so often they have a kind of historical analog. But having said all of that, you know, I also think it's possible to get a bit lost in the past, or kind of you know, I guess part of the point of me writing this book now and being enthusiastic about talking to you was about the relevance, you know, how is really of sort of, how do these things apply now? What's a sort of practical use? And I guess you know, I feel I've, you know, far from a sort of expert about the sort of feminists within the kind of modern Liberal Democrat Party. You know, obviously, you know, Shirley Williams as Vera Britten's, you know, daughter comes from a really sort of proud feminist sort of lineage, and I know about some other individuals. I remember I wrote an article once about women mayors, and I was really impressed by Dorothy Thornhill, and also, you know, I was, at the time I remember being quite surprised and chastened even to sort of realize that, you know, Watford had a woman directly elected mayor who didn't know much about, I think, before Labour had any of the new you know, wave of elected mayors. So I guess I think that, you know, and obviously, you know, feminism and liberalism, you know, as you know, meant from Mill and going back beyond that to Mary Wollstonecraft, who was a revolutionary, but a liberal revolutionary, you know, they're sort of, you know, they come into being together. I mean, in Britain, really, thanks to Mary Wollstonecraft and her remarkable, you know, sort of foresight, you know, her pioneering sort of, you know, you've got this kind of feminist strand in sort of progressive politics from really early on.
Yes.
And that, you know, and that's radical, but it is also liberal. So I suppose I think one of the reasons I'm glad Liberal Voice for Women exists is because I think that it's really valuable if the women in every political party do sort of have a kind of consciousness, as you know, a sort of sex consciousness in a way, and think about, you know, politics for women, and I guess within feminism, and people often are very dismissive about liberal feminism, and I think broadly speaking, basically sort of see it as kind of neoliberal feminism, kind of lean in feminism, all about individual, quite narrowly defined, sort of freedom to do this, do what you want, in individualism. And whereas I suppose for the purposes of this discussion, I'm more interested in feminist liberalism, and thinking about what feminist liberalism was and is now. Yes.
So the current topics that beset us really are things like prostitution and surrogacy and sex and gender issues, all those issues which are right at the fingertips of feminists today. How do you know about the Liberal Democrats' perspectives on these?
I don't feel sort of expert. I mean, I know the liberal. I think lots of gender critical women have been very disappointed by the liberal perspective on sex and gender, and specifically the sort of disregard of women's free speech, feminist free speech, particularly. I guess on reproductive rights, I think liberals have been generally been good. And obviously there is a kind of strong, socially liberal, social democratic, bit of the party, isn't there, that is very supportive of public services that are supportive to women, in relation to childcare, healthcare, and so on. But I guess I think it's also a sort of a mixed picture, and I suppose I think particularly the kind of trade-offs between sort of liberty and social this sort of campaigns for social protection, which I guess is one of the themes of my book, is women wanting to be free and equal, but also seeking specific I don't know if protection is quite the right word, but forms of social security and safeguards, forms of security and safeguards from the state, and kind of trying to sort of balance out those two things. That just seems to me really sort of core to what any kind of progressive party needs to be thinking about. And I think that with the growth of a kind of globalized sex industry, and sex and reproductive technology industries, and the specific and particular and extreme risks to women and girls online, it's really important to kind of be clear about the risks as well as the freedoms.
Yes, I suppose that we need to take more view of the harm principle that both Mills put together. And think more about the harms that are being done to women all over the world by various, like pornography, Pornhub, the use of surrogacy, which kind of is very instrumentalist, isn't it? It's very degrading to the donors of eggs, who can in some cases be injured by actually the drugs that are used to harvest lots of eggs.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, obviously it's just coming over the horizon, isn't it? But obviously surrogacy has been quite, strongly regulated in the UK. It's, there is no commercial surrogacy, and I think that's how it should stay, absolutely. And I'm really, I think it's really concerning, the idea that, clinics in, countries that are much poorer than ours are sort of advertising and, sort of developing a market in this sort of international baby market.
There's a Law Commission proposal to change it. That's a real worry, isn't it? Now, you say that you were astonished when you came across Winifred Holtby making a case for us to use gender rather than sex. Do you think it would help us to talk more about gender?
Well, no, I don't. I think that obviously that has been the direction of travel sort of since the 70s, really, which is when Anne Oakley, the sociologist and very good writer, makes her distinction, which I think is a useful distinction between sex as a sort of biological fact of life and gender as a social fact of life. And I was astonished to see Winifred Holtby basically suggesting exactly that sort of distinction in 1932, and also interested in her reasons for doing so, which was quite explicitly because sex was kind of icky. It was too, I think the phrase is too linked to the kind of amorous and creative instincts, by which she clearly means sex. And so if you want to talk about women and men and you don't want to be thinking about actual sex, would a term like gender be useful? Which is what Ruth Bader Ginsburg sort of famously concluded in some of her early arguments before the US Supreme Court, that if she was trying to make arguments against sex discrimination, that the judges might be sort of influenced in the wrong direction if she kept on saying sex, that somehow that might draw attention to, take their minds in a direction she didn't really want them to go in. And hence she decided to use the sort of euphemism or synonym gender. But obviously since then, it's become a very confused, there's now this general confusion about whether gender is a synonym for sex, whether it means the social aspect of sex, as per Anne Oakley and other sociologists from the 70s and onwards, or whether it is whether it's shorthand, a sort of short version of gender identity, which means, as you know, something completely different, which means a kind of person's internal psychological sense of which sex they belong to or ought to belong to. So it's a complete muddle, and that is really why I think it's quite a difficult term to use now, because there's not a general agreement about what the definition is. So I think that trying to talk about sex more is seems to me a better plan, although I do acknowledge that it does obviously have this double meaning, because it's also used as shorthand for sexual intercourse, as well as the male-female distinction. But language is complicated. I'm not saying I haven't necessarily reached the final answer on any of this, but certainly for the moment, I personally find gender really quite tricky, just because I don't think we all know what we're talking about.
Yeah, when you were talking about Eleanor Rathbone, just coming back to her, because she is fascinating, isn't she? You say what difference it could have made to the development of women's politics had the 1945 Parliament included a feminist independent, in the way that Eleanor Rathbone got elected early on, is an interesting counterfactual. Rathbone had shown what could be achieved from such a position. Would you care to expand on this?
Yeah, no, I'd love to. So Eleanor Rathbone is a sort of giant, honestly, of British parliamentary feminist politics. And I do think the main reason that she's not better known is that she wasn't in a party. So there's just nobody that's been able to make an industry out of turning her into an icon. So in that sense, it's a pity she was an independent, because if she'd been in the Labour Party, she'd be on all the walls. She, might be on the wall of Rachel Reeves's office. Although Ellen Wilkinson is, welcome to her place on that wall too. Another admirable figure. But Eleanor Rathbone, she usually voted with Labour once she's in Parliament. She's from 1929 election. I think she's elected, and before that, she's a really important campaigner and lobbyist. Leads the suffrage organisation after Millicent Fawcett steps aside. Really for decades, she's just a hugely important sort of figure in our national life. Also extremely prescient on foreign policy, anticipated the Hitler-Stalin pact, supported Churchill to be the wartime prime minister, although they were really, she'd also opposed him bitterly over his anti-feminism, but she, understood that, or thought that he would be the best wartime leader. So I think in a way she kind of modeled what it would be like to have a women's party. She told Parliament she was 100% feminist, and really she always put women's interests first. That was her primary commitment, hence her deciding to be an independent, was just that I'm going to be the MP for women, which other women MPs had done. I think a lot of the first generation of women MPs felt that sort of responsibility, including Nancy Astor, obviously as a Tory. And they used to get loads of letters from women. Obviously, once women had the vote, then there was some women in Parliament, and they was like, come on then, what are you going to do for us? And so to an extent that was a cross-party phenomenon, but some Labour women were also well, I think some women in all parties, that wasn't really their agenda, but it absolutely was Eleanor Rathbone's. We have her to thank basically for child benefit, which she fought a sort of 20-year campaign for child benefit. But she died in 1946, and her friend Mary Stocks, who I think wrote the first biography of her, stood as a candidate, as an independent in that in the post-war election, and only just lost by 147 votes. So there could potentially have been somebody to kind of take that torch on and go on being the kind of 100% feminist MP for women if Mary Stocks, whose background was all in feminist campaigning, had been elected. But obviously, it's always tough for independents. I think Eleanor Rathbone pulled it off, because of her extraordinary personal and political capacities. And I certainly, I don't know whether Mary Stocks would have had those skills or not. But it does feel like there was this kind of, it was a really important part of the first women in Parliament that there was this independent feminist who was a remarkable politician. And then that story kind of ends basically when she died. And it's just interesting that it could so easily have had a sort of another chapter. And it's a shame, actually. I can't help saying I think it would have been interesting to see what would have happened if that had carried on.
Yeah. I wonder whether the women who are standing now as women candidates might want to start a Rathbone Society, the way the Fawcett Society developed.
Yeah, I think there is some sort of Rathbone Society in Liverpool, which is where she came from. But I suppose I feel now that it just isn't how party politics, it isn't how electoral politics has developed in this country or really anywhere. I mean, I guess with the Swedish Women's Party, there was a kind of upsurge of thinking that maybe women's, but I suppose that's why I'm more interested in at the moment in thinking about feminist liberalism, because at the moment, with the kind of political setup that we have, the most productive way forward to me seems that that parties should have their sort of feminist caucus within them.
Yes.
And that women MPs should have this, as has always been the case, have a consciousness of sex and about women, a thought about women and girls as part of their, not their exclusive, but as part of their politics.
Although it hasn't been easy, has it? I mean, even with the Labour Party, with their history of women being elected early on, although there was Margaret Wintringham, an early Liberal MP.
Yes.
Even there, they had such trouble, which you recount admirably, I have to say. They had such trouble getting policies that would benefit families, women, girls, children generally, past the unions, past the higher up politicians. It was a struggle, really. They did it with one hand tied behind them, didn't they?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's sort of unbelievable to be reminded that when Harriet Harman entered Parliament, I think it's like less than 5%, it's like 3% or something of MPs are women. You sort of can hardly believe it. I mean, obviously, this is a long time ago now, the 80s, but I was alive then, and it seems incredible that Parliament was basically all men. Yeah. And obviously it was less diverse in other ways as well, but it's shocking.
Yeah. We've got some questions coming up. I'm gonna go first to David Barnsdale, who's got a really good question. It came quite early on. David, are you ready to ask? Let's see. I'll give you a moment, and if you don't, I'll ask the question. But
I'm doing it on my phone, so it's a bit awkward.
Okay.
It's just in your first chapter on Mary Wollstonecraft, you mention how her opposition, some of her feminism was framed as in opposition to Rousseau, but also tantalizing that part of her was that Rousseau was her mentor. And it struck me that when she was in France during the French Revolution, she gravitated to the Girondins, and the Girondins were the main opponents of Robespierre, who was absolutely 100% a disciple of Rousseau. And for him, the male chauvinism of Rousseau was not a bug, but a feature, because he was deeply hostile to any involvement of women in politics at all. And I wonder if you see a connection there.
Yes, I think there is a connection. I mean, the Girondins are much more feminist than the Jacobins. I'm not a historian of the French Revolution, but that is, unarguably the case. And I think that, I think that, in a way, Rousseau, I mean, who knows if Mary Wollstonecraft would ever have written The Vindication without her sort of rage and disappointment at Rousseau as a kind of prompt. The whole, education is absolutely, crucial to her sort of political philosophy and her sort of, belief in reason and the need to sort of, for humans, this kind of moral responsibility to kind of develop and cherish our capacity for reason. And she's just so insulted. I mean, you often get that, actually. I think, there's people, no, they're not all like that, but lots of women's rights activists, part of their kind of motivation is this kind of outrage, this really sort of moral outrage that they're being sort of excluded from, what they see as social goods, social progress, public progress, and they want to be in it. And I think that's is hugely important to Mary Wollstonecraft, her sort of sense of unjustified exclusion from, of girls and women from education. And yeah, I mean, who knows if the French Revolution had gone a different way, but it obviously went the exceptionally bloody way that it did, and that was a very, chastening and extraordinary experience for her. One of my favorite pieces of writing about her actually is Richard Holmes's chapter about her in his book Footsteps, which isn't a full biography, it's a chapter, but I think he really admires her and really has a strong feeling about her as a sort of romantic, capital R, I don't mean in a sort of lovey-dovey sense, but as a kind of real forerunner of the sort of political philosophy that he, I think, most admires, and he really acknowledges her as a really important forerunner of the Romantic poets and all sorts of sort of English Romanticism, writ large, and he absolutely places Mary Wollstonecraft at the heart of that, and her sort of belief in, the individual sort of moral sensibility, reason and sensibility, and the importance of nurturing our individual capacities is absolutely at the heart of that, I think. Sorry, it's rather a long answer. Get carried away about Mary, like lots of people.
Any more feedback, David?
Oh, it just thank you. Yeah.
Okay, great. And I think Jane, you've got a question that you asked earlier on, and that was to do with. Oh yeah, should we? Are you with us?
Yes.
About the GRA?
Yes, Susanna, I'm sorry to kind of put you on the spot politically, but should we have in 2025 hashtag repeal the GRA at the front and the centre of feminist claims now?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think that no, I think that would be a disaster, actually. I mean, I think such a lot of energy has been absorbed by these kind of struggles over gender identity over the past few years. It's absolutely exhausting. And I don't think, I mean, I think it's been absolutely vital to the stand that's been taken against the sort of principle of gender self-identification in the UK. But I think there's lots of better things that we could have been doing, and I include myself in that. And I think that, I mean, it's difficult to, you can't turn the clock back, but I just think it's been such a kind of disaster that sort of the kind of radical wing of trans activism and Stonewall and so on, decided to make, decided that the GRA, the Gender Recognition Act, wasn't enough. and that they had to kind of conquer this next, cross the next bridge or whatever, and get self-ID. So I would just like to sort of default back to where we were before that extremely damaging and misconceived and destructive sort of campaign. And obviously, pending the very important Supreme Court judgment and the need for clarity about the way that the Gender Recognition Act and the Equality Act interrelate. And I do think it's absolutely vital that that clarity about the meaning of sex and the explicit protections for single-sex sports and spaces are sort of confirmed. But obviously that's, we have to wait and see what happens there. I can see you've got your hand up. You're gonna let's ask a supplementary.
Sorry, I'm quite surprised, because before 2004, although there was confusion about the use of the word gender to mean sex, because journalists egregiously and everyone else were too prudish to use the word sex for the sexual reproductive categories, which will always exist. At least I hope they will, unless
unless we all become robots.
Transgenderism does become transhumanism, which is, we know, one of the tech bros, or more than one of the tech bros' ambitions. No, seriously, I come at this from a scientific point of view. It is impossible, in my view, to support any notion of a separation of the spirit. Somehow I'm gesturing that it's coming from your head, saying that you are of a separate sex to your body, which is embodied, which is real, which is provable, which has so many other attributes that are all connected together in that sexed XX for female, XY for male, with rare, very rare exceptions. I can't understand why. But my desire is to get rid of the Gender Recognition Act, which I think is the worst piece of legislation that the UK Parliament has ever passed. And of course, there are lots of contenders for that title.
Yeah. I mean, I guess it's, politics is always about priorities, isn't it? And decisions about, and I guess, obviously that's your right to have that view that that's a priority, but it's not, I would just question whether that's the best use of your political campaigning, time and effort, personally. But yeah, to disagree on that one.
Thanks. I've got another question for you. You write in your epilogue, it's difficult to feel optimistic about the prospects for women and girls at this moment. And has this feeling changed since you finished writing?
No, I'm sorry to say that it hasn't. And I've been asked about this before, and it's a shame not to be able to say things are looking up. But I don't think they are. I think that the climate crisis and environmental change, poses specific and very grave threats to women and girls, who are much less likely to manage to migrate, for example, away from too hot places. Partly because of responsibilities with children, but also kind of, social roles, what you might call gender, make it easier for men to move around in basically every country in the world. And I've already alluded to the impact of technology, which I think is a really subtle and complicated issue, actually. And it, I just think it seems really clear to me now that there are differential effects on the sexes of all sorts of things online. Most obvious, pornography is an obvious example, but it's not the only one by any means. Even the way that girls and boys, as children, I mean, use the internet. I just think you can see from that, that there are some really significant differences, and where those derive from, what is the reason for them, I can't answer, and it's maybe unanswerable in a sort of definitive sense, but it's absolutely a sort of fact of social life. And I feel really concerned that that those industries, you know, it just feels like that, you know, they just feel like among some of the most kind of male dominated and sort of macho dominated industries that have ever existed. So while, you know, the kind of promise of tech is always about sort of you know, utopian progress, future, and so on, it feels, you know, absolutely sort of turning back the clock, really, in terms of you know, and obviously there've always been, you know, areas of the workforce that are much more sex segregated than others. You know, obviously anything to do with manual labor. You know, I think sometimes people that, like me, who work in sort of professional intellectual jobs, just can lose sight of that, which is just really unhelpful. You know, newsrooms, you know, well, you know, often are really quite mixed, and obviously women and men can be journalists, but obviously there are you know, many areas of work that are massively sex segregated. I mean, teaching is still hugely sex segregated, you know, huge majority of primary, and I think that sort of so it's just important to be sort of honest and realistic about the world as it is, and so technology is one over that. Obviously, you know, on other ongoing issues that haven't been resolved, including childcare, women's poverty. I mean, another thing that, you know, comes to mind is you know, there was a story I read last week just about the hotel of mum and dad being fuller than ever, and, you know, younger people, because of the property market, finding it harder and harder to get themselves established, get independent of parents. And I think that, you know, affects young women more than young men, because young women, you know, men can have children when they're older. You know, I was hugely conscious, you know, just as a girl who and young women who wanted to have a career and a family, you know, I definitely in my 20s was kind of thinking about that. You know, I remember asking my GP about it once, you know, just kind of questions about the sort of, you know, how late was it, you know, when should you not risk leaving it too long to have children, etc. And obviously these things have always been around, but if you find it, if you have to wait another 10 years before you've got a place to live of your own, and then it's another sort of obstacle, and so I feel worried about young women from that regard. I've got 2 daughters, and so I think there's all sorts of things, of ways in which doesn't necessarily seem obvious that obviously the housing crisis is a problem for everybody, but I really think it's important to differentiate between social phenomena and policies, and to think about sex, as well as obviously other differences, age and race and ethnicity and so on.
We've got a question now from Sue England. Sue? Are you unmuted?
I am unmuted now, am I? You can hear me?
Yes.
Okay, right. Okay, well, I'm very interested in demographics. So I mean, there are so many things to say about that. But the birth rate is dropping rapidly all over the world, and has been for 200 years, in fact. And it's down to things like 1.1 in China now, 0.8 in South Korea, etc. And our birth rate has dropped as well. I do remember there was great excitement that for some reason it was going to go up. The academics thought in about 2005, and in fact it's going down. So just to ask, there's an awful lot of comment from all sorts of commentators, which usually starts, it's a disaster, the birth rate is dropping. Very, very obviously neutral way of putting it. So any comments on that you think are useful?
So I have to be honest and say it's not something I've sort of thought a huge amount about. I mean, I obviously understand from a kind of you know, public policy point of view why an aging population is very challenging for states that want to make, you know, generous provision for older people. If, you know, you've got a smaller population of younger people trying to sort of support a larger population of older people. You know, I mean, I suppose as a global phenomenon, I haven't thought about it so much, and, you know, I feel like I'm more familiar with a kind of a sort of different argument about demographics in Africa, for example, in some African countries where the birth rate is still much higher, and obviously, you know, some NGOs and so on want to reduce it and think that education and women's rights and public health and so on would be improved if women had fewer children and were more in control of their, you know, obviously what's happened historically is that when women have more control over the reproductive lives, they have fewer children. I mean, I've been very quite involved in green politics at various points, and you know, I suppose in the context of the environmental threat, I personally find it difficult to sort of get worked up about the idea that you know, falling human population is a huge problem, but you know, growing human population is also a problem in a different way. I just think we're at such a tricky point really, and obviously I understand that, you know, I'm not in favor of sort of trying to artificially shrink the population of, you know, and I understand that rich people over consuming, you know, and rich people consume far more per capita than you know, many people in poorer countries with far higher birth rates. So I understand all that sort of the kind of inequality, global dimension of it. I guess, yeah, it's tricky, isn't it? As a sort of, you know, humanistic person, you sort of want people to have the lives that they want. And obviously that doesn't mean everybody having children, but, you know, for lots of people, I don't know if I can say most people, you know, it does seem like having the opportunity to have children if they want to is something that is valuable. Yeah, I guess I don't fully understand it, and I can't explain it, but I understand that it's challenging, but from a policy perspective.
Well, I just made one comment, which is I'm always very puzzled when they say old people are dependents and need to be looked after, and then they say, so we need more children. So children are dependents and need to be looked after. So nobody seems to do the sum.
Well, they want more working age adults, don't they? They want more, you know.
Yes, exactly.
The children are supposed to grow into working age adults.
Who's looking after the children? Who's looking after the children, the working adults, if there are more children?
Yeah.
Children are dependents too. So
yeah,
they're asking for the impossible, aren't they?
Yeah. No, I mean, obviously the whole balance between the kind of, you know, the bits of our lives in which and I guess I think, you know, feminists, you know, over a long period have obviously thought about this a lot. You know, it's the debate about care, but, you know, the kind of balance between the bits of our lives when we're dependents and the bits of the lives when people depend on us has obviously shifted dramatically, you know, many times. And obviously, you know, nearly all women used to be dependents because they didn't work, and had children and other relatives depending on them. I guess I think that's another of the sort of biggest challenges for us really as a sort of species, is to sort of work out how to, you know, look after ourselves and each other.
Helen Baxter, you've got a question, I think.
Hello, I hadn't expected to ask a question today, but as we've got onto birth rate, I felt that as our resident millennial, I should chime in and ask a question. I don't quite know where to start because I've got lots of thoughts on this, and obviously I'm late 30s, childless, single, etc., and have lots and lots of friends in the same situation. Perhaps picking up on what you said about the number of young people living at home. I mean, I lived independently for a long time, but my brother's 34 and still lives at home. It's much more likely that boys are still living at home, or men, I'm calling them boys in their 30s, men. It's something like, I think it's 25% of men and between 25 and 35, something like that, and 15% of women. Definitely seems to me that the issue is it's the men that have got the issue, if you like. I mean, generalizing, of course, but sort of young, professional, well-educated women like me are doing great. We've got our own homes, etc., financially independent, struggling to find a man that's really kind of worth giving up that element of independence for. And I have a few friends now having babies on their own with sperm donors. That's certainly becoming increasingly common. I realise I speak as a very affluent, educated professional living in London, and I should say the ladies that had babies with sperm donors don't live in London, because I think it probably would be unaffordable here. Sorry, that's just a bit of a ramble, but I suppose what are your thoughts on that? Because I'm torn between thinking, oh, it's terrible, and also thinking I wouldn't want to give up any of the freedoms that I have, and I wouldn't really want to change anything about my life. And I'm aware of how lucky I am compared to women in previous generations. Yeah.
So, this is just one way of answering your question, which just comes to mind, which is that obviously, so writing my book and writing about feminists historically, most, although not all, of the kind of, women that we've mentioned, George Eliot, the Brontes, Eleanor Rathbone, Ellen Wilkinson, are women that did not have children. Nancy Astor had loads. There's always exceptions, that's not, but broadly speaking, the women that were able to do something in public life, did not have husbands and children to be looking after. Virginia Woolf's another one, who I've always and I think there's a really interesting sort of tension in feminism about the kind of needs of women versus the needs of mothers. And so Eleanor Rathbone is a sort of fantastic example of a woman who never married. Her life partner was another woman. It's not, well, her biographer doesn't think it was a lesbian relationship, but it was certainly a life partnership, an intimate relationship. And she didn't have children herself, but she was a sort of lifelong advocate for the rights of mothers. We owe child benefit to her. So I guess I feel like there's always been, and I just mentioned my grandmother, who was somebody who had 3 children and didn't have a career. She had gone to university and was very, in some ways, I think my grandmother would have been a happier person if she had the career and not had a family. Which is an irony, because I wouldn't exist and my mother wouldn't exist, but she really was, she loved her, children, and I don't quite know what my mum thinks about that, but there's certainly part of her that was never fulfilled and was very frustrated by her life, really. Whereas I can absolutely see her having been a kind of don or a teacher in a school and having sort of loved that as well. Obviously, in the kind of, I've been very lucky and managed to have a professional job and a family, and I suppose to me that feels like a sort of ideal, that I want to be available to everybody, to have something that they do for themselves that feels fulfilling and means that they're independent, and also to be able to have a family if they want to. And I feel really sorry and just upset, I suppose, that feels like it's becoming less, it does feel like it's becoming less possible again for some reason. That I don't, and I think I do think property is absolutely crucial. I think that
it's definitely part of it. Yeah.
I think that not being able to have a home, and I think everybody loves their home, don't they? It's sort of, people have such strong feelings about the place that they live in. So I think sort of, I found separating from my parents a real big effort. I've got a daughter who's just gone away to university. I really struggled with it in my 20s. I had psychotherapy to give me quite a lot of help. I really look back, and I suppose I think something everybody manages in the end, but I really was struggling in quite a serious way, and I feel like I needed that help to sort of enable me to do it. I guess I'd have got there in the end, but I'm just acknowledging that I really needed help with that. I don't think it's an easy thing to do. I think this sort of system we have in the UK of going away to university is meant to enable that. It does sort of facilitate it. You have this sort of stepping stone in a way that's provided for you, where you sort of have this, coming and going for a bit. So yeah, I guess so. I'd never sort of say that having a family is better than having a job. It's sort of ridiculous. Lots of the women who've achieved the best things in the artistically and so on have had work and not had a family. But I do think it's a kind of, it should be a worry for sort of well, everybody, but particularly people who think about social policy, if it is becoming harder for people. And I suppose I feel, one of the things I find a bit frustrating about sort of sexual politics at the moment is that while I absolutely want to be, and feel like I am, a sort of advocate for women's rights and for women and girls, I also do want to be an advocate for men. I'm not going to say men's rights, because that's usually anti-feminism, but I think there is a kind of issue around sort of human relationships, really, and that I think is really sad and troubling. Obviously not that heterosexual relationships are the only thing that's valid, but for most people that is the route to having a family. It's the easiest one. It's so anyway, does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, thank you. That's really interesting. And the point about women being happy without children having careers is clearly the case. There's lots of evidence that single women are some of the happiest people, obviously, if you're financially stable. But so I end up coming back to what you've just said. I end up worrying about men more. And also because that has an impact on women, lots of young, angry, single men is not good for society and ends up having negative consequences for women as well. So I think we need the men to step up. I think we need the men to step up to help the men.
Yeah, no, I think that's, and lots of lonely, miserable people is just not good for anyone. And I think there is lots of evidence, isn't there, that that single women definitely do better than single men, where I think it's even associated with sort of more increased mortality and so on.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Just an ad for the future. Michael Conroy, who does a lot of work with men and boys, is going to be talking to us later on this spring. So look forward to that, people. Thanks, Helen, for that question. Susanna, it's a really difficult question, isn't it? Because are boys and men being deprived of the opportunity to grow themselves into being men who would be able to commit to the sort of relationships that I and no doubt you have previously enjoyed? Speak of you. Where you I'm just going to pin this. There we are. I was missing that. That young men and young boys aren't getting that encouragement to develop the resourcefulness and the dependability, if you like, that will encourage women like Helen to be able to depend upon them.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think obviously I've mentioned housing is one issue, but I guess I just think it's it must be to do with the structure of work, and sort of cultural, societal, cultural sort of influences and so on. It's a big, I'm not sure I can answer that, but yeah.
One of the things a little gem that I hadn't realised until I read your book was that in 1945. Conservative Central Office, they decreed that every candidate selection shortlist, should have a woman on it. And that strikes me as being very prescient, really.
Yeah, I think I really like B. Campbell's book, Iron Ladies, about Thatcherism, and there's a really sort of fascinating sort of sexual politics of Toryism, really including the Primrose League, which was a kind of grassroots sort of aristocratic lady-led kind of women's organisation in the Conservative Party. I mean, I guess the sort of it's the sort of beginnings of the kind of door knocking, operations of today.
That was Disraeli's time, right?
And later. I mean, it goes right, until the I don't know when it's disbanded actually, but it's certainly around in the early 20th century. And there's a period when the Guardian women's page is suspended, and the Conservative Women's Magazine has a women's page. I think particularly in the post-war period. I mean, there's a whole really interesting, lots of interesting evidence about why men are worried about women getting the vote. Basically, what will women do with it? And one of the concerns by left-wing men, socialist men, and trade unionist men is that women are too conservative, and that comes up quite a lot. It was also an idea of Frantz Fanon's that that women are a kind of intrinsically sort of conservative, basically, where men are the radicals, and that is one of the reasons why some the Labour Party gives more support to women's suffrage than the other parties in the end, but there is also a quite strong resistance to it, and that is one of the reasons for it. There's a great quote as well from one of a sort of Tory that says that the miners' wives are really wild. The miners are wild, but the wives, God help us when they're in the ballot, get the ballot into the polling booth. So I think that's just a sort of interesting, I think, a sort of theme in itself. Is that it's men's ideas about what women will do when they can vote, and then obviously from 1928 onwards they find out. But then you get the war, which obviously is kind of in the 30s, basically. It sort of takes over everything from really early in the 30s. It's sort of the whole of politics becomes, well, not the whole, but foreign policy is looming so large that lots of the other stuff sort of gets slightly shelved. And then you get the welfare state, which, obviously the other point about Eleanor Rathbone sort of fading away when she did, and obviously child benefit is part of it, but but is that the welfare state is, you know, configured on a really quite traditional sort of male breadwinner, you know, female dependent model, and is you know, so although the health benefits, in particular the NHS and the extension of sort of healthcare to women is absolutely, you know, is really a huge important and sort of progress for women. In some other regards, the welfare state is not very feminist at all, or even quite unfeminist. And then I think the way that the Conservative Party sort of understands and sort of reads women in the post-war period is really interesting. And, you know, in the 50s, women voted Tory. I think it's a sort of 12-point gap. You know, everyone's fed up with rationing, and the Tories make quite a clever sort of pitch to women. You know, it's Barbara Castle who's famous for saying jam today, not jam tomorrow, but women voters sort of thought that was Tory policy more than Labour policy, that they were going to get rid of rationing and build nice houses.
Well, I can remember when Harold Macmillan said, "You've never had it so good," and that's the perception, I think, that was quite common in the late 50s, that after the privations of wartime and post-war austerity, which we've got back again, the 50s was an era of growth and upward mobility, if you like.
Yeah, I think, I mean, in terms of just, you know, British English political history, and particularly the sort of history of social democratic politics, it's just a really interesting sort of paradox that obviously the Attlee government, the post-war period, the beginnings of the NHS is always the sort of moment that we all sort of hark back to as, you know, the sort of bit of a false dawn, but also a really precious, you know, heritage that we still have in the NHS and so on. But that simultaneously, the period that immediately sort of the post-war period, really from the late 40s onwards, is regarded as, in terms of sexual politics, really conservative, you know, with the 50s obviously as the kind of cliched sort of period of sort of the domestic goddess. So I think that's just a kind of interesting sort of, you know, paradoxical, contradictory sort of thing about and I think, you know, part of that is because some of that stuff about the 50s is not really accurate. There were always more women in the workforce in the UK than, for example, in the US. I sometimes, you know, some of it is a kind of false image of what the 50s was really like.
Yes.
So I think some of it's, but nonetheless, you know, 50s culture was, you know, no question that it was pretty sexist in many ways. And the fact that you sort of simultaneously have the beginnings of the welfare state and this kind of, you know, renewed sort of you know, almost sort of separate spheres, you know, kind of quite accentuated ideas of femininity and kind of domesticity, you know, it's interesting.
And I think that was the ad people trying to sell us an image, wasn't it?
It certainly partly was. Yeah.
But I was fortunate because both my parents had worked hard during the war and beforehand, and all that upheaval and travel and getting around a bit, I think they probably were glad to be back to what passes for normal. But they both gave up steady jobs to become self-employed, and both parents were working from home. So it was a really different way of living from what you saw projected on screens, whether they are large or small. Another real gem here is Irene White, who I think was the first provincial journalist for Manchester to gain lobby accreditation, a political lobby journalist. She worked hard to get equal pay back in 1947, and I think she did really well with a private members bill on divorce as well. Got to second reading, but didn't actually get very far because the government fobbed her off with a royal commission. Somebody like that, again, that we don't remember as well as we should do. How do you think?
No, I mean, I think there's a whole number of female parliamentarians, to be honest, who are sort of more or less forgotten, and it's sad. You know, I guess I don't think that, you know, it doesn't say anything very great about, you know, the state of, you know, contemporary feminism, but also, you know, I mean, I guess there's lots of things to know about, aren't there? And, you know, can't know about everything. So obviously I've been researching this subject for, you know, working on this project for the last few years and feel quite passionate. Some of these women ought to be, you know, how can everybody not know about Eleanor Rathbone? But I think there are some conservative women definitely who you sort of feel like, my God, I can't believe there isn't even a biography of X or Y, you know, whereas I think the Labour Party does you know, hold its kind of icons, you know, Ellen Wilkinson, Jenny Lee, so on, pretty close. It feels sometimes it's a bit like until Margaret Thatcher, and apart from Nancy Astor, they sort of weren't that bothered or weren't that interested. You know, not everybody obviously, but I know there are some proud Tory feminists. But
yes, you say there's an accommodation to be found between feminists and gay men and lesbian women who want their sex-based rights to be upheld, and transgender people who want their gender identities to be respected. Now, this is a big question, I think. What accommodation do you see coming between the sex realists, like we would like to think of ourselves, and the sex deniers that seem to be believers in gender identity?
Yeah, well, I think my position is a liberal one. You know, I think that, I mean, I absolutely have no truck with sex denial. I think it's really but sort of just, it's just a dead end, I think, really. It's just not true. Sex is important. And I think it's really unhelpful for anyone to be sort of convinced that it is irrelevant and not meaningful in human life. But I mean, I suppose I sort of think, you know, it goes back to the question before. I sort of think the GRA was a kind of attempt at an accommodation, you know, which was to kind of codify gender reassignment and to say that if somebody, you know, felt that they, you know, needed to live as if they were a member of the opposite sex, then they should be allowed to do that, and they could have a certificate that would make that easier. And then I think that all the kind of problems, really, I mean, I accept that there were some issues with the drafting of the Equality Act in 2010 and the way that the kind of conflicts between those two bits of legislation were not fully sort of worked through. But nonetheless, there are the exceptions in the Equality Act are there. And I sort of think if people had sort of left well alone and just, you know, accepted that, you know, I don't think you can change sex, but I think people can believe whatever they want about themselves. People believe all sorts of things for all sorts of reasons, you know. I mean, I suppose that's why I think, you know, that the decision in the Maya Forstater case and the fact that gender critical beliefs are protected and you know, presumably gender identity beliefs are also protected, it was so important, you know, really crucial. So I sort of don't care what people believe about themselves, and I'm happy for the state to make accommodations for people to sort of enable them to manage life, but you know, that is just not going to be, I mean, I think as British feminist, you know, a really good moment is going to be over our dead bodies, basically, that you're going to take away women's rights that have been fought for literally hundreds of years.
Yeah.
Just no. And I'm so, you know, I'm sort of relieved that I don't think it's over, and it's certainly not over internationally, but I do think that a lot of the heavy lifting has been done, thank goodness. And I feel really sort of pleased, but also, you know, a sense of sort of regret and sort of exhaustion with the amount of effort that's gone into that. I wouldn't have dreamed in a million years that I would spend sort of, you know, 3-4 years of my life really putting a lot of effort into this. You know, as you mentioned at the beginning, I set up a community council and was really involved in community politics, was involved in green politics. There's so many things to do in the world, you know, and the idea that we've had to be fighting sex denial really for years, I mean, it's terrible. It's really, really terrible.
So do you see an accommodation that, I agree, has to come? There has to be some sort of reconciliation, if you like. Do you think that an accommodation would be that, okay, we'd accept that they could call themselves what they like, but keep out of our spaces? Do you think if we could make sure that there are plenty of mixed sex lavatories, let's say, and mixed sex changing rooms and single sex changing rooms, because men as well want the single sex spaces too, do you think that would go some way towards accommodation? Or are some of the activists on the side of gender, they actually want to go into women's spaces to get the validation?
I think what you first sketched out, I think broadly speaking, you know, in sort of clarity and the capacity to sort of enforce single sex spaces, and, you know, particularly clarity for service providers, you know, who is vital. And yes, broadly speaking, I think that having single sex spaces and mixed sexed or mixed, gender neutral spaces, however they, what people want to call them, is a good way forward. I mean, that's what we have in my workplace, for example, is, women's toilets, men's toilets, and some gender neutral ones. That does seem to me a humane and pragmatic sort of way of dealing with the situation.
I think with the pressure from other people in other countries overseas, I can't see that we're ever going to be rid of different gender people coming on somehow or other. We've got to get used to that. But I think the shock was, whereas the drafters of the GRA thought there would be about 4,000 people would need that. In fact, not only the people who need it, but obviously there have been a huge number of people who wanted that ability to inhabit a different gender space, much more than the 4,000 they originally, 4,000 or 5,000 they originally planned for. So do you think that it might be something that will be not a flash in the pan, but it will be a fashion that will eventually fall out of favour?
So I don't want to get rid of anybody, and I think that there have been people for quite a long time that, there's been, people who've cross-dressed, obviously,
Oh, yeah.
Women as well as men, and then some who, really wanted to kind of reinvent themselves, I suppose, take on an identity, change their name and so on. And I sort of think in a liberal society that is allowed, and that ought to be allowed. I mean, I guess I think that, for the kind of multiplicity of, and that's one thing. And then obviously there's the kind of diagnostic, obviously for many people, that isn't just about a kind of wish to be something other. It's about a really profound distress and unease with the body and the social identity that they have. And obviously hence the kind of diagnosis of gender dysphoria and so on, and attempts to kind of medicalize and sort of treat that, which obviously are ongoing. And I think all those, that diagnosis exists, and obviously people are, as we seeking treatment for it, adults as well as, I think it's right that there should be a really high level of caution with young people. But I'm certainly not against adults being able to, access treatment that they think helps them. I guess where I'm sort of more, I mean, I am really sort of skeptical about the kind of, 30 genders and all that kind of, nonsense, really, which I do think is nonsense. And when I want to be respectful of somebody that sort of wants to be called they, them, and doesn't want to kind of acknowledge their sex, I also think that is a form of sort of sex denial, really. And I don't quite know how to cope with that, I suppose, is my honest sort of answer to that. I don't think it's really sustainable, I suppose. I think that, it might be plausible at one moment in your life to kind of be non-binary, but sort of, what when you get ovarian cancer? I mean, it just doesn't seem to me to sort of add up. It's just that we are sexed humans, and there's some aspects of our lives, most obviously those around our reproductive systems, obviously, because those are the most sort of sexed bits of us, that, you can't go through life completely untouched by your reproductive system. It's literally impossible. So I just worry really about what this kind of identity, which is a kind of obviously a sort of mind identity thing, how it's sort of the interface between that and your sort of insides.
Yes.
I go to yoga classes where which are mixed classes, but where the teacher talks a lot about women's kind of aging bodies and sort of. So I just feel worried for people, I suppose, really, about some of this stuff. I just think it's really unhelpful, kind of damaging sort of nonsense, and so some of it I do think is a fashion, and but not all of. I don't want to be dismissive of people with gender dysphoria. Yeah,
I agree with you. I'm sure there is some, but I think that the huge rise in young girls wanting to be other than girls, I think that's not necessarily to do with genuine gender dysphoria, because that's not consistent, and resistant. Is to do with these objectification that they confront once they get into puberty.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think there's quite a lot of evidence for that. I think the the disparity in the numbers and the different ages at which people seem to reach that conclusion that their sex is intolerable, I think absolutely speaks to that. And I think that the particular problems of adolescent girls and their wish to sort of escape being a girl or a woman is, it's not.
It's understandable, isn't it?
Well, it's understandable, but it's also important to confront that head on and not just to say, oh yeah, fine, you can be something else then, because actually you can't. I mean, you can try, but I think it's not very easy.
I read the other day of a woman in a shop whose child said, a little boy said, I want to be a girl, and she's saying, the whole shop listened to see how she dealt with that. Oh, well, you can't be. And then she said, well, why do you want to be? And he'd been told in the play group that he couldn't play in the playhouse because that was just for girls. So she was able to sort that out. Now, those are the sort of issues that are quite easily dealt with if you've got some conversation going on. But there are deeper seated issues, aren't there? And those are the girls who are being abused or maybe autistic or, have got adverse childhood experiences, who really do absolutely need psychotherapy, and would benefit much more from that than being handed out a prescription for a puberty blocker or the opposite sex hormones, I think. How do you feel about that?
Well, I mean, that does seem, that is the policy, isn't it? That is what the Cass Review broadly says, and that is, so I mean, I think I have got some, I haven't sort of looked into this extensively, but I mean, I've picked up some concern about the way that some of the new gender services are developing. But broadly speaking, I'm sort of reassured that that the government doesn't want to be blocking puberty, and I think that's absolutely the right decision. I think it was really concerning. And appalling the way it was kind of missold, really, as a kind of pause when you can't actually pause life. It's just not a thing you can do. It's a sort of fantasy, I think.
We've got one more. We've got lots of comments which are really helpful, but we've got one more question. Again, it's from David. David, do you want to ask your question about Anne Oakley?
Well, it's just that you talked about her making a distinction between sex and gender, but reading her book, there's a chapter at the beginning where she talks about sex. Then from then on, she tries very hard to explain everything as just gender. And the one thing the chapter that was most striking was on crimes, where she's trying to say that actually the fact that men commit crimes at a greater extent and more violent is one example, she goes like judges are too lenient on women, and that's the reason why men get convicted more. And Julie Bindel said that this minimizing sex was important early on in feminism because employment was important, and people were saying that women can't do this because men and women are different. But if you have that tactic, then you open it up to Judith Butler, and then you do have completely explicit postmodernist sex denialism.
I think that there is a kind of tactical error, really, by I get sort of cross with people sort of blaming feminists for sort of attempts to demolish feminism. but I do think that there was a kind of sort of tactical error, and a sort of that you sort of thought that they could just hold on to a kind of knowledge about sexual difference, but you didn't really have to talk about it. You could just talk about gender. I think that was a kind of political sort of move, really, that they thought sexual difference is really complicated, does involve biology, which also, frankly, these sociologists did not understand or were not trained in. So I think there's also a thing about different disciplines and kind of knowledge and kind of overreach, to be honest, by sort of the humanities in wanting to kind of explain everything. So all the kind of biology was kind of like, oh, whoa, and also evolution had such a kind of grim, sort of a lot of connotations, partly because of sort of eugenics and, you know, eugenics being seen as progressive in the early 20th century, you know, including by people like William Beveridge. So I think that it's kind of like biology, bleh, yuck. So let's just kind of do society, you know, we do society, and we can just look at men and women through society. And I think I do agree that has had some very unintended consequences, to put it mildly. Yeah.
Okay.
If I might comment, I think the consequences are not unintended. I don't think you're saying there, obviously, they had a limited scope, these sociologists, but they were never thinking about boys and girls. And the people who came along and have colonized this, Foucault and then this Judith Butler woman, they all have written in support of paedophilia. And it's a deliberate tactic to queer the boundaries, destroying all boundaries. And I don't think Anna Oakley or any of the early feminists, you see, they weren't thinking about this completely mixing up the boundaries between childhood and adulthood in that way. And also, they were not anticipating a direct attack by paedophiles to mix up, to smash through the boundaries of children and pushing sexuality onto them, you know, and not leaving them a childhood to sort of grow into this later time when men and women were supposed to try and deal more equally with one another, you know, and deal with adult sexuality and childbirth and child breeding and all those things. So
Yeah, I mean, the whole issue of sort of child safeguarding and the way that sort of queer theory has I agree been used to undermine that in some ways. It feels like a bit of a big subject and not something I'm gonna sort of get into at 8:45. But yeah, I listened to the first part of Alex Renton's I think I've got his name right, new series on Radio 4, which is about the paedophile information exchange, which is very sort of sobering listening. I mean, I think it's a different issue, but I think that the sort of idea about I guess on the unintended intended, I mean, I know about Foucault's kind of views on paedophilia or sex with children, and I guess I think that, you know, I don't think all post-structuralist or postmodernist philosophers should be tarred with that brush by any means. I think for some of them it definitely was unintended. I mean, I think there are lots of people who were into queering boundaries and transgression who never thought it would have any bearing on the definition of a child, or, you know, obviously people I think transgressing boundaries and subversion, you know, sounds good, but everyone's got some, you know, it's just where you draw the line, you know, which boundaries. So I sort of think I look back at, you know, when I was a student and kind of reading quite a lot of that stuff, and, you know, and it all sounded quite fun, and, you know, and I guess the problem for me is just the sort of failure to sort of draw lines, or to think about some, you know, I guess in that sort of intellectual realm of kind of reading texts using these tools, you know, you don't feel like you're kind of doing literary studies and doing sort of, you know, gender swapping in Shakespeare or whatever. That feels a million miles away from, you know, safeguarding policy in children's social care. You know, in one way it is a million miles away, but somehow over the past sort of 30 years, we've ended up with they're sort of feeling like some of this kind of theory has kind of escaped from the academic humanities and the social sciences, and sort of made its way into a space that's also a policy space. So I guess, yeah, that is
just a bit of information. I remember sociology students 40 plus years ago telling me that they now knew that children should be having sex with adults. That was more than 40 years ago, and that wasn't sort of theory.
No, but that's absolutely in keeping with what the
happen.
PI aims were. I was astonished to hear on the radio that they thought the age of consent should be 4. And this guy worked at the Open University as a press officer. I mean, it's just, it's sort of breathtaking, really. Yeah.
Look, it's getting late, and we've had quite a few really good questions. Thank you so much, everybody, for your questions. Thanks to Rachel for managing the event for Liberal Voice for Women. We hope to be able to put the talk up on our YouTube channel as soon as we can, but that's not guaranteed because we've got so much time and so much work and so little time. Thank you for all your great questions and comments. We're next going to meet on Monday, the 10th of February, when our guest will be Matilda Gosling, author of Teenagers, The Evidence Base. So if you've got any teenagers in your family or extended family, you'll want to hear this. I've got a copy of this book. It's not yet been published, but it's coming out soon. And she's written a number of other important papers. So we're going to be talking about teenagers, gender, and the workplace with her. So do look out for the announcement or sign up to our website anyway, and we'll send you the invitation as soon as it comes out. We also want to hear from you with any policy-related issues or problems that you want us to raise. So thank you so much, Susanna. It's been a really encouraging evening talking to you. I've had great fun. I hope we've, I know we've taken up a lot of your time, but it's been really interesting to hear from you. Thank you again.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah.
I've enjoyed it, and thank you for the questions.
Thank you so much.